Hi, I'm Jamie Wright, middle school librarian, and one of my favorite things is helping people find great books to read. If you already have a successful reading life, the chances are that you already know a lot about what you do and don't like to read. If you don't read very often or enjoy reading very much, or if you're stuck rereading the same familiar books, understanding genres might help you find your next great book. Genre is a French word, and it means a category that has shared characteristics. Movies have genres too. They might be adventures or romances or comedies, for example. Going into a library or bookstore can be overwhelming if there are a lot of books and you aren't sure where to start. So, knowing about different types of genres can help you get closer to something you want to read. Before we talk about different types of genres, we need to clarify four things. First, sometimes young students learn that fiction and nonfiction are two different genres. That's not totally untrue, but they are also bigger categories than what people usually mean when they talk about genres. Fiction books have invented stories, and nonfiction books describe real information. And within each of those categories, you can also find more specific genres or classifications. Second, today we're only going to be dealing with fictional genres. We can talk about nonfiction genres in a different episode. Third, there is a difference between format and genre. Sometimes people use these words interchangeably, but genres are categories of describing what books are about, while formats describe how the book is organized. So, for example, a graphic novel could be written in any genre. It could be realistic fiction, it could be fantasy, science fiction, anything. The fact that it's a graphic novel is its format. And same thing for novels written in verse. They could be historical fiction or realistic fiction. The fact that a book is a graphic novel or is written in verse has to do with its format, not the genre. And fourth, there are always books that could reasonably belong to more than one genre, and you could argue forever about which category fits it best. The purpose of genres isn't to have an absolute rule, but to provide guidelines that will help readers find what they're looking for. Sometimes books will surprise you by breaking rules and expectations, and that can make a book harder to classify. That's okay, that's interesting. Just remember that all of the genre characteristics are guidelines, and many books have exceptions. The point is that knowing the general categories of books might help you start finding the types of books that are most interesting to you. Realistic fiction books focus on stories set in the present about relationships between people, often about families and home life, friendship and school, or growing up. These books can tackle serious topics like divorce, illness, moving, bullying, or injustice. They can also be lighter, like the story of someone who makes a new friend, or it could handle serious topics in a humorous way. Example plots in realistic fiction might be that a character has just moved to a new place and started a new school, or a friendship is changing and one character wants it to stay the same, or a family member is ill, or a character is feeling upset about family expectations. Magical realism is a popular genre, or maybe more of a subgenre, because it's a cross between realistic fiction and fantasy. Generally, magical realism books are books where the main point is the real relationship between people, like with realistic fiction. But there is one fantasy element, like maybe two friends magically switch places, or a student struggling in school finds a magic pencil that writes correct answers. Even though there's a fantasy twist, the point of the story is about who the people are and how they connect. For example, how they work as a family or whether their friendship continues. Another type of magical realism might be books that show human like speech or thoughts coming from animals, even though the animals otherwise live in realistic conditions. An example would be The One and Only Ivan by Katherine Applegate. The story is completely told from Ivan's point of view, but it's realistic that he could be in this situation, although we could argue unfortunate too. But it's not like he carries a briefcase and works as an accountant with a bunch of other gorillas in an alternate universe. The fantasy piece of it is his ability to communicate what he's thinking in this story to us. Fantasy books typically show magic users, witches, wizards, enchanters, or dragons and unicorns, and their magic spells, magic creatures, or magic items as important parts of the story's world and the plot. These could be set in the present or in an invented past or future. Examples of fantasy book plots might be that wizards are using magic to attack dragons guarding a treasure, or two kingdoms are fighting over a magic sphere that provides healing, or a unicorn helps a wizard perfect a spell to save a village from an evil wizard. Science fiction books are similar to fantasy stories, except their fictional worlds contain technology instead of magic that does not exist in our present society. Often, this technology relates to things like time travel or space travel or aliens or futuristic inventions. Examples of science fiction plots might be people trying to defend against an alien invasion, or people living on a spaceship with futuristic technology in a political conflict with others over rights to a planet's resources. In terms of movies for science fiction, you could think Star Wars, Star Trek, and Dune for examples. Science fiction generally includes a subgenre of books called dystopian fiction, which describes societies with rules and traditions that are different and usually meant to be darker than our own society, sort of a warning about what we could become if we're not careful. Example dystopian plots include communities that are very restrictive about individual expression, government conspiracies that seek to control every aspect of human lives, maybe for money or power. And sometimes the dystopian societies also have futuristic technology, like how the people travel or how they communicate. Historical fiction books are set in real past time periods, and the plot usually involves a true event that really happened, and sometimes a real historical person is a minor character who appears in that book, like a king is seen riding through a crowd from the fictional character's perspective. These books often have fascinating looks at different time periods and places, and how different people might have viewed or experienced events like war, natural disasters, political changes, disease, or inventions or fads of that time period. Mystery books are about solving a crime. They may have characters dealing with relationships, or they might be funny, but the whole point of the story is to be introduced to a crime and watch the characters solve it. Example plots include characters who witness a theft and try to solve it, or characters who follow a series of clues and puzzles to discover a treasure. Adventure fiction overlaps with a lot of other fiction genres. Travel and lots of physical conflict or danger are common to adventure books. Typical topics for adventure books are road trips, pirates on the high seas, action sequences and chase scenes, bad guys and fight scenes, and lots of physical danger that's meant to be exciting and thrilling. This can often be funny, and lots of mysteries also include adventure elements. Many fantasy books also have adventurous plots. A subgenre of adventure might be survival or outdoor adventure, where the main character is struggling with physical survival due to a natural disaster or a man-made problem. Many of these books show characters isolated from other people and forced to find food and shelter, sometimes battling wild animals, extreme weather, or villains. Humor is a tricky genre because what's funny is so different to different people. I found that in libraries, a lot of books go in the humor section that aren't necessarily super funny. Often these are series books that are really more realistic fiction stories. For me, I think if the author's intention is clearly to make people laugh through the book, more than any other purpose, it's a humorous book. But humor does overlap a lot of the other genres too. If there's mystery or a magic user is present, it might still be funny, but then it goes in mystery or fantasy instead of humor. If it's really about the relationships and it happens to be funny in places, it belongs more in realistic fiction than humor, but you can see how the categories overlap. Humorous books also overlap with adventure books because heroes often get themselves into ridiculous scrapes and trade barbs with enemies. If it's kind of ridiculous and silly and it doesn't have elements of other genres like magic users or a historical setting or a crime to solve, it might go in humor. Sports fiction can also overlap with a lot of humor or realistic fiction books. In sports fiction, it's an invented story where the sport is central to the plot. There are realistic fiction books where a character might go play tennis, or nonfiction sports books about how to play tennis or who the star tennis players are. But a sports fiction book about tennis will show the main character entering a tournament and practicing tennis all the way through the book to prepare for that tournament scene near the end. Sports fiction books might have funny characters or be about relationships or growing up, but what the sport means to the character is the key aspect of the book. Romance fiction is also about relationships like realistic fiction, but it focuses on romantic relationships. Typically, some sort of problem keeps the characters from getting together, and the book is about how they solve that problem and fall in love or start dating. It's often funny, or it can involve sports or a mystery, but the point of the book is the love story. Horror fiction usually involves monsters, human or otherwise, and the point of the story is to scare the reader. So it's a type of adventure fiction and sometimes even mystery, but the point is to escape the crime rather than to solve it. An example of a horror story is that a werewolf is attacking a community or a killer might be on the loose. A subgenre here is thriller. It might be less about physical violence or scary things might happen that you're told about but not shown. But here, the scary threat might be more psychological in nature. For example, a person might be living a regular life, but it turns out that everyone around her has been lying to her about some important thing, and they're all in on it, and she can only trust herself to escape the situation and find the truth. Another related subgenre might be supernatural. So maybe ghosts or undead spirits are in the story, but the point isn't to scare the reader. These books might end up in fantasy because of the presence of ghosts or supernatural beings or even mystery, depending on the plot. But sometimes a book in the horror genre is only there because ghosts or vampires are in the story, even if it's not really about the danger they present. As writers blend genres and break rules and times change, other types of genres emerge. For example, an increase in romance stories with fantasy settings is leading to a genre called romantasy. I want to emphasize it's not important to put a book in a particular box, because often the best books are the ones that break expectations, and sometimes that includes genre. The key is understanding genre guidelines to help you find a book you're more likely to read and enjoy. So if you walk into a bookstore or a library and all you really know is you kind of want a short book, there are still thousands of choices. But if you go in and you say you really like action and fight scenes and a little bit of history and you don't mind some magic, that lets a librarian or a bookseller help you get where you need to be. Genres can also be helpful search filters. So if you're using a catalog or book menu or book list, it's good to have a sense of which genres appeal to you. All that said, you might really love one mystery but dislike most of the others, or you might really like World War II historical fiction but not be interested in other time periods. Just because you tend to like science fiction stories, it doesn't mean you can expect to pull any book from that section and like it. We'll talk more about strategies for choosing specific books in another video. But understanding genres can help you get to something that gives you a better chance of finding your next great book.